Oh, hello there. It's time for the Sunday live stream of Adam's Music Box. So come one, come all, and invite your friends. So today's stream is about the stream. It's about channel because people have asked me why I started this channel. I began it last year, no conception of time whatsoever. I began it earlier this year, round about the beginning of the year, and it was not my idea. It was a suggestion from a very close friend. And this friend said, "Well, you love talking about music, and we love talking about music." And so this person said, "Well, why don't you just start a YouTube channel? You don't need to do anything fancy with it. Just sit in front of the microphone and talk about the musical stuff that you would talk about in real life." And that really got me thinking about a lot of things. So let's start with music and what it means to me, what it means to others, what it means to the cultures of and the history of the world. Well, music is one of those peculiar things insofar as musicality predated the actual invention by mankind of music. This is to say that things that we observed in the world around us had properties of musicality without necessarily being what we would normally define as music. There's the typical examples of, birds singing, cats meowing, the waves crashing against the shore, the wind through the trees, other things that you would find in, pre industrial, even pre civilizational nature. But music as we know it began when a person decided to purposefully make certain sounds for a particular reason and order them in such a way that wouldn't have otherwise naturally occurred. In this sense, it is true art. And the word art and the word artificial are related because it means made by humans as opposed to something naturally occurring outside of the human realm. Now, obviously, the human realm is part of nature and it interacts with plant life and animal life and all of the other things that were not directly created by human hands. But music is very particular, even within this framework, insofar as sound is absolute. Pitches are something that we can identify, and they would exist with or without our acknowledgement of them, with or without our identification of them. But once we've identified them, some people took it upon themselves to do things with them, to arrange them. And in this sense, we're using the word arrange, not in the way we'd use it in the modern sense. And I've talked about many of my favorite arrangers on this channel, people like Don Costa, people like Gordon Jenkins, etc. But we're using it in so far as we mean composition to put sound in order, to create human patterns with sound, but in this is very important, sound that has a certain organic resonance with the human mind. Now, what do I mean by that? Hold on, I need to turn off this little portable heater. There we go. So what do I mean by that? Well, one of my first videos, I talked about how we can learn a lot about music from our friends in the animal kingdom because there are certain sounds that do have objective properties. Now, how can we determine this experientially? Well, whether you're a baby who doesn't really speak any known language, whether you speak English and English alone, Mandarin Chinese and Mandarin Chinese alone, Hindi, French, German, Spanish, any language in the world that you can think of. When we hear animals make certain sounds, they send certain objective messages that we as humans understand, irrespective of our linguistic background. So when a dog goes, you know that it wants, to go for a walk or you to feed it. When it's, that it's being defensive and it may well bite. Same with cats. Meow, wants, pat on the head or you're going to get scratched. The same is true with any animal. We have, through our experience with animals, we've learned what these things mean. Sound has certain meanings, and the meanings aren't absolute, but they are very important signposts, very important guidelines that help us to understand what sound means. And that's why for most of the history of music, people have unconsciously and on some occasions consciously assigned certain frequencies in the sonic spectrum with certain certain emotions. And when you arrange those in a certain way to create music, you are conveying emotional information. One moment. Always remember to stay hydrated, boys and girls, especially if you're a singer. I know some singers like a bit of warm cognac before a gig. It loosens the vocal cords. You don't need to be a singer to enjoy that, though. I was a drummer myself, plus the cognac. Anyway, so we can say that music does have objective properties. And some of the greatest composers ever, the reason that they were able to tug on our heartstrings the way that they were able to do is because they had a higher than average understanding of how best to arrange these frequencies to create this emotional messaging. And the reason that we know that this can exist independently of any other art form is look at pieces of music that are considered absolute as opposed to programmatic. So, what is programmatic? Oh, the Russian Easter Overture. Wonder what that's about. It's about the Christian Easter in the Russian Orthodox Church. What is Romeo and Juliet? We're going with the Russians today. About, well, it's Tchaikovsky's emotional understanding of a narrative created in a play by William Shakespeare several centuries earlier. But what is Beethoven's Fifth? Well, it's the Fifth Symphony he wrote. That conveys in biographical information, but it doesn't convey emotional information. The emotional information conveyed by Beethoven is all in the way that he put sounds which exist and can be heard in nature in a certain order, told them to be played. Now, this is where the formal arrangement comes in by certain instruments within the orchestra. And the thing that you get when you put it all together is very refined and profound emotional messaging delivered through the medium of sonic communication as opposed to visual or even, I don't know, smell-o-vision, which was actually a thing in 1960. Michael Todd upgraded, if you will, his Taudio system, which incorporated 70 millimeter projection, magnetic surround sound, and put contraptions in the cinema that let sort of like these air fresheners out whose odor was supposed to correspond with the narrative. So you can use many different, however heterodox, media to try to communicate emotion. But of course, music is my favorite, which is why I started a music channel. Well, the reason why I started is someone said you might as well do it. But there you go. Now, why is music so important to so many people? I think that in many ways, it's the purest artificial means of emotional communication. So, for instance, when animals send signals with pheromones or grunts or things they do with their bodies to each other, we could say that is an organic form of emotional communication because all it requires is the animal, the body of the animal itself, rather, and things that are learned instinctively, things that are learned by reflex, as opposed to through exploration and through refinement, and in some cases, even education. With music, it is the highest form of that kind of emotional communication that is done through artificial means, meaning humans did something to the sounds that we naturally find in nature that nature couldn't do itself. When the wind blows through the trees, it doesn't sound like Beethoven's Ninth. When the waves crash against the shore, it doesn't sound like Herbie Hancock's Maiden Voyage. When the birds are singing to each other, it doesn't sound like Robin Trower's guitar. These are all artificial things that people have done. And there's something about music that has always particularly delighted me. And again, because of the truism, the scientific truism behind the fact that music is about emotional communication, we're not always able to readily articulate what it is that's being communicated that you or me or someone else might like, because it is difficult verbally to express emotion. That's another reason why people create music. And to answer my own question, it's one of the reasons that people regularly listen to music, because other forms of emotional communication are simply not as effective. If you want to, I personally think it's much easier to express something with a guitar, a violin, or a piano than it is with words. Now, words have a lot of utility, both in terms of emotional communication and in terms of informational communication. But while music might not be as important in terms of information, although lyrics have their origin in the communication of information, the actual instrumental music itself is really about pure emotion. For those of you who didn't see the stream where I talked about the history of lyrics, we can sum it up here. Basically, lyrics derive from poetry, because poetry, long before it was ever written down, it was communicated orally, and one person from one area to another area would communicate it. It would be committed to memory, and for important information, like about the history of a nation, like some of the Hellenic nations of the BC era, it would be passed from generation to generation. Now, how does this differ from just, regular prosaic verbiage? Well, lyrics and poetry, which are somewhat interchangeable terms, lyrics are just when you set the poetry to a musical, to music, to instrumental music. The reason, though, that rhyme, rhythm, meter, all of these things became important is that it's much easier to remember a song than it is to remember words that are non lyrical. And I'll give you the perfect example. These days that we have smartphones, no one remembers anyone's phone number. Not Some people can barely even remember their own. But I guarantee you that anyone with a radio in the early 80s will remember 8675309. Why? Because Tommy Two Tone put those otherwise meaningless numbers to a song. And that is the reason that poetry, that lyricism, became an important means to communicate the news in both pre literate societies and in other various primitive societies, some of which still pass the news along to their fellow inhabitants of a certain society to this day. So I suppose that those are the explanations of me trying to rationalize my love of music. But the good news is, one, we don't need to rationalize our love of music. And number two, why should we? Music does something to people, not all people. In fact, one of the most interesting things about psychological development, and it's something that Freud talked about, understanding the division between oneself and the ego, the ego of someone else, recognizing that the feeling of this oceanic independence is broken when we make contact with the outside world. We realize that things aren't mechanistic. We realize that things outside behave in such a way that we feel is irrational, or that we feel is immoral, or that we feel is disadvantageous to us. And I suppose that that can help explain why, when I suppose growing up, I was the kind of person that assumed everyone loved music as much as I did. Not everyone does. And this channel and others have at least tried to explain why certain generations and certain cultures at certain periods of time are more in love, more collectively in love with music than other generations in other times and other places. Now, bringing it back down to the sort of day to day happenstance of things, one of the reasons that I started this channel is because it is sort of the 21st century version of me hanging out at stores and hi fi stores. Because when people would hang out at those places, they would learn a lot, they would discover things, they would do it through just going through the stacks of records. And to a degree, we can still do this. We can do it both manually on Spotify by searching for things that we think, but it's also something that can happen via algorithms. And algorithms aren't that different than a record store, because the guy at the record store might say, well, hey, if you like the Moody Blues, you might also like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, for instance. And now we have algorithms that tell us that, although an algorithm can never predict the subjective things within human minds that make us have an emotional connection or disconnection from one thing or another. So one of the things that this channel fulfills is that gathering, that accidental gathering when one person runs into another at a record shop. It doesn't have to be the guy working there. It can just be someone shopping there, someone hanging out, the guy selling weed in the back. It could be any of those people. And they'll have discussions that, oh yeah, I like this record. Oh, I don't know that one. I know the band. Oh yeah. Well, did you know that this guitar player used to be in this band? Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. And all of these sorts of discussions. And it's happened to me in record shops that specialize in all different kinds of music. And it's not always the people that you think. I mean, there are no stereotypes in music. There is only stereophonic sound. I'm here all week. Um, for instance, once when I was at a record store years ago that specialized in classical music, one of the guys shopping there was a guy. He was a plumber. He was wearing his plumber's uniform. He was maybe on a lunch break or something. I don't know. And we got talking, and he was such an expert in different orchestras and different conductors and different composers. And this, as a young kid, was just so fun for me. And there were so many other people that drifted in and out of people's lives. And you didn't necessarily stay in touch with them, but these were just random conversations that happened because people were in a record store and they shared at least one thing. They shared the awareness that the guy standing next to me there likes music. And he could always be there, buying a Christmas present for someone who likes music. But when it's not Christmas time, chances are someone was in a record shop because they were interested at least in some kind of music. And those conversations were great. And there are still record stores that are going strong, mainly in the bigger cities. The main corporate chains have all gone. There's not much of a reason for them to exist outside of Japan, where they still very much exist, but everywhere else they pretty much don't. But you've still got a lot of good independent record stores that are either used or specialty stores where you can still have these conversations. But for all of the criticism that music streaming gets from the old men screaming at the cloud, something we're all guilty of, one thing that's amazing about music streaming is how much it has democratized access to music. If someone had told me as a kid that one day there will be a device where you can listen to virtually everything that has ever been recorded at the push of a button, and it won't even, you would think, well, one, I did that sounds like space age men on the moon type of thing. But surely it must cost, $10 million per year. But no, that's not how it works. Spotify's monthly membership is far less expensive than the equivalent of buying an LP or a CD back before the internet was a thing. So again, in an age of inflation, when everything from the food we eat to the places we live in have become exponentially more expensive, music has not only become more accessible because of the democratization made possible by technology, but also because it's now much more cost effective. It's the only thing that, whether when you're adjusting for inflation or not, it's actually become a lot less expensive to actually encounter recorded music. Now, obviously, the radio was always free. So the caveat is, music that you're self curating or curating in such a way that is aimed at pandering to you, an algorithm, if you will. So that was extraordinary. And it's something that Frank Zappa actually predicted in the 80s. He said that he envisages a future where records and CDs and such will be obsolete and that people will be able to get high fidelity music through a fiber optic cable plugged into their stereo system, much like in the 80s you had pay-per-view cable shows, mainly things like the big boxing matches, and other things like that. It was something called pay-per-view. Now sort of everything is pay-per-view in a way, but we don't use the term anymore, at least not much. And Zappa was onto something because voila, it's the fiber optic cable that is one of the most common ways to receive internet access, and the music is coming through there via a connection to the World Wide Web. So Zappa, much as he predicted the fall of the Berlin Wall, just around I think 9 months, maybe just under a year before it actually fell, he also predicted music streaming. And it's just a pity he didn't live to see it. So for all of the downsides, financial, sociological, and otherwise, that we talk about, I think we also need to talk about the upsides, not least because the financial side can be rectified if musicians found a way to negotiate well. And maybe they will. I think someday they may. That's for another story. So this channel is in many ways the companion to streaming, in the same way that the conversation at the record shop was the companion to the actual experience of going through the bins and shopping for the records. And some might argue that, oh, it's less personal because we're not in the same room, we're not necessarily in the same place. But look at the upsides to that. Most people going to record stores were limited to the people around their house. Maybe they'd go to record stores when they were traveling for a vacation or for work or whatever. But with YouTube, theoretically anyone in the world can listen to me or other channels, and I can tell from some of the statistics that I check once in a blue moon that there are people listening to this from just about every continent in the world. I've had people from the obvious countries because it's an English speaking channel, so you're US, Canada, UK, Australia, but you have people from Japan, people from India, people from Egypt, once people from China I've seen. I don't know how, maybe with the VPN. But it's great because that wouldn't have been possible in the old world of having to go to a record store. So I think one of the things I've done with this channel is to embrace all that is good with technology, because there's a feature of the human condition in which we tend to blame technology for things that we really ought to blame on ourselves. Because at the end of the day, technology is only as good as the people using it. A gun can be used to save a life in a situation of danger, or it could be used to commit a crime. A hammer, could do many things as well. A car, anything. And so when people talk about AI, when people talk about streaming, the internet in general, it's only as good as the original human input. I mean, AI itself has to, at some point in that chain, in that sort of chain of informational custody, it needs to have human input. It can't just train itself out of nowhere. There needs to be human informational data input somewhere along that chain of custody. And so I don't really see the internet as dehumanizing us. I see it as a chance to actually rehumanize us. If we choose not to, then we should blame ourselves and the role that we play collectively in shaping our society. Because if you live in any big city, at least in the Western world, nothing is as safe as it used to be. Nothing is as friendly as it used to be. Nothing is as accessible or affordable as it used to be. And you can't blame people talking about stuff on the internet for that. You can blame the same people who have had ruinous effects on societies in the past, long before anyone knew what a YouTube or an AI or an internet was. So maybe this is sort of the young man screaming down at the cloud, which is a helpful sort of yin yang balance to the old man screaming up at the cloud. Um, I want to give a shout out to two people who I've never communicated with, but who kind of, once I was told to start this channel, they very much inspired me because I had been watching their stuff for infotainment purposes for a long time. One is Dave Spiria, otherwise known as Harmless Dave. He used to be called the Real Music Observer, but now he goes by Harmless Dave. Really fun channel. And of course, Rick Beato, who needs no introduction, because if you're in that ecosystem, as they call it, of music YouTube, you probably know who Rick Beato is. And I think my channel tends to serve as a different function. Harmless Dave really does great updates on music news, weaves them in with really interesting and I tend to find very good opinions. Rick Beato generally approaches music from the inside out, the technical side, and using it as sort of a pedagogical tool because he was a music professor after all. And what is my role in this mix on the youngest and smallest of those channels? Well, I tend to sort of freestyle it. I talk about why I like something and what it is. And most importantly, though, if there's anything that I really want to accomplish with this channel, I want to introduce music to people that haven't heard it before. So I want to talk about something and tell people why I like it. And I want at least some of those people to think, if this guy likes this so much, maybe I should check it out. And now it's easy to do because you can go to YouTube, Go to Spotify, Apple Music, Tidal, Amazon, any of these different places, and you can listen to it and you can see if it does for you anything kind of sort of similar to what it does for me. And in that sense, I think that's why I love this channel, because there's something gratifying and fun about introducing music to people. And maybe there's a bit of selfishness in that. Maybe it's a bit of a sin of pride, maybe, where people think, I mean, imagine the mother who thinks her kid, who isn't particularly bright or good looking, is the best kid in the world and introduces him to others as such. That could get partly annoying, but that maternal instinct, when molded and shaped by the modern world, it has that effect in some mothers. And maybe we in the world of music, we feel that same pride in sharing our musical family, our family on vinyl and streaming and CD and tape and everything else with other people. Say, check this. I'm so proud of Beethoven. And I'm so proud of how Furtwängler conducts it. Maybe you would be too. Maybe that's a psychological explanation. So that would be about selfishness and egotism. But then there's another explanation, which is the opposite side of that coin, and that is altruism. Maybe people who love music feel so strongly about the importance of music that we almost feel as though we're being uncharitable, that we're being mean, that we're being Scrooge like if we don't share it with the world for them to either like or dislike, but they should at least know it exists. They should at least be given that opportunity to fulfill the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness that is possible through the sonic experience of music. So whether it's the sort of egotistic experience of a mother promoting the virtues of her kid to people who don't necessarily want to hear it, or whether it's the altruism of giving people the opportunity to experience art and decide for themselves whether they like it or not, between those two things, I think that the guy you met at the record store 40 years ago, or channels like this, channels like Rick Beato, channels like Harmless Dave, so many others, too many to name, I think that they play a vital role in keeping our conversations dominated by that which at least I love more than anything in the world. And that, my friends, is music. And that is the stream for today. Let me know what you think about all of these topics. And as always, because I'm playing the records, I'm not playing the algorithm, sharing these videos, liking, subscribing, donating with a membership, all of that good fun stuff is super helpful and fun for all. As always, say it again, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.